Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the fourth GSPP annual conference. It is a pleasure to have you here, and it's a great pleasure for me personally and for all of us to have Professor Vinod Thomas to give a presentation and an opening speech for our conference. Professor Vinod is going to talk about governance.
That we are seeing the impacts of COVID-19 and SDGs, which is a more holistic way of looking at development, could not be more timely in its implementation at this time. So since our time is fairly limited, I hope to speak for about less than 30 minutes and have a good discussion period to bring everybody in. I will use a PowerPoint and we go through that fairly quickly. Of course, these will be available to you later, so not to worry about the details. Let me just check with Ricardo. Are we all okay, clear on the sound and the presentation?
Perfect.
Okay, all right. So let me just give away the main messages of the presentation up front. So in case we run out of time, I would have covered the most important thing. I got good feedback on this from a number of colleagues, among them Shigeo, Dennis Ditre, Ricardo himself, Medina, and Ed Araral, who's my colleague in NUS, LKY, Lee Kuan Yew School, with whom Nazarbayev has this wonderful collaboration. And so I thank the organizers as well, including the Astana Civil Service Hub. So the main message is that the context we are living in right now is one of great fragility. COVID-19 is the biggest embodiment of that. But I want to emphasize that COVID-19 is not a one-off event. We are looking at a series of years to come when we will be seeing different varieties of crises. It could be health pandemics, but it could also be climate-related disasters, which will affect Central Asia and other regions of the world. And so they call for deep, systematic, structural action. And we are personally aware of the difficulties people are facing, but the response needs to be multi-pronged and the response needs to be deep. However, the challenge, the next message is that when you're in the midst of a crisis, the last thing you can think about often is structural change, deep changes, changes that will bring fruit in 5 years, because we can barely think of putting food on the table, getting a job and getting on with our life. And people would hope to get back to how things were a year ago. And that is the challenge. But my point here, and the analysis seems to support it, is that a crisis situation is the best time to make these changes. And if we did not, then the next time around, it would be that much harder. So we owe it to the current generation and to the next generation that we make fundamental changes right now. And for Central Asia, how do we make a number of changes? Because you will see that the challenges are not one, but they are multi-pronged. And one thought, and we'll come back to that at the end, is that when we have issues on health and the environment and financial and debt management, and of course, governance, most importantly, in a way, it helps to draw on what are called synergies, the links across countries, across sectors like health and education, across thematic areas like climate change and developing infrastructure, and among stakeholders, government and business and the civil society. And in this case, at the end of the day, the trust, the three groups in this case, you can add household as well, is probably the single biggest challenge or important step we can take. Do the stakeholders trust those who are driving change to drive the change in the interest of the society? So that may be the single biggest issue. And we need to keep our eyes on the medium term. So that really is the message of the seminar as applied to Central Asia, the 5 countries as well as the region more broadly. And since we are looking at countries that are big and small, the global context cannot be escaped. A word on COVID-19. This, of course, has affected everyone. Europe and Central Asia taken together, the broader group, you see that the growth rate has declined already. We had difficulties in 2019, but we're looking at negative growth expected in 2020. That's no surprise to the audience here. Will it recover is the question. And one or two points right away. To be pinned or focused only on commodity prices or one or two export items is obviously a huge issue and a problem at this time. So diversification would be the way to go under particularly troublesome times. And a lot of issues on the healthcare systems and supply chains and having social safety nets. They are inadequate right now. These rise to the top as issues with COVID-19. Now, when you think about Central Asia in particular, of course, the region has been going through a transformation already. I may mention four of them in my discussion with Shigekatsu this morning. We said that, well, the rural-urban is a natural one. All the world faces that, but Central Asia in particular has concerns on how that is going. Agriculture to manufacturing to services, that is the second transformation in play. Plan to market, different degrees. We learned a lot that free market just left to its own is not what we mean by a market economy. It has to have regulations, particularly when there are spillovers and externalities, but a nuanced version of market with a guiding hand on how that market should function for the betterment of society. That would be a transition that is still ongoing, I think you would agree. And of course, the institutions and governance, that building of that trust that we mentioned. These are transitions that are ongoing. In the meantime, at the same time, for the region in particular, there is the fragility of trade that is of great concern. That includes the question of diversification. It includes the question of oil. That includes the question of also remittances in a number of countries which are high and on average, let's say 10% at least. And how energy will be managed in the period of climate change cannot escape that. Renewable and clean energy will have to be the way. It's not that I wish this were the case. It's going to be the necessity. But the only question is how we will make that transition. Will it be a smooth one? Will it be a soft landing? Or will it be a hard landing? And so that would be a critical issue of concern for Kazakhstan. And then, of course, COVID has showed health systems are weak, especially for the vulnerable. And education, we'll see, is not only an access issue, but also the quality. And it goes all the way from primary to higher education. There is no escaping that. So with that, the SDGs, if you look at the 17 SDGs, you will see that they give an umbrella for all these issues of serious concern. You could say, my goodness, if we had followed SDGs for the last 25 years, more holistically, we would be in a much stronger position to be resilient against these crises, okay? And so, in a way, to summarize the 17 in a slightly different way, this slide says that, of course, number one, reviving incomes of the people is essential. We saw the immediate growth rate declining, right? We'll come to the details of the countries in a minute, but reviving that is absolutely essential. No question about that. But that's only a necessary condition. The sufficient condition includes that growth has to be inclusive. Income distribution is getting worse, and the lower income strata are particularly hit by the crises. And here I want to emphasize, when we talk about better income distribution, we do not mean handing over more money to the low income groups, but we mean that let growth be generated from the low income group as much as anybody else, and perhaps even more. Let growth come from the low income group, investing in the education and the health of the low income population. So that's a huge distinction between giving money away so that we have a better income versus driving growth through the low income population's contribution. And third, we have to face the fact that we have ignored the environment, thinking that growth comes first, cleaning up comes second. False. That's a recipe for total disaster. And so dealing with climate change and the environment would be the third. And finally, the political and governance of transition. In this session, my session, probably won't be enough time to get into the big questions of the political economy. But let me just say that political reform may be the single biggest issue for having everything else done. Or put a different way, without political reform, 1, 2, and 3 will be very hard to achieve. So with that as the background, and in the next two slides, I will go through very quickly because there are a lot of details, and I think you are familiar with most of what I have here. But let me just emphasize that if you take a $3.20 poverty rate, in the broader region of so-called ECA, that's the World Bank's definition of Europe and Central Asia, 2.2 million people may slip into poverty. Now, you may think, oh, okay, that's not a big number, but originally the idea is that people will slip out of poverty. Now you slip into poverty, so the swing factor is even much bigger. So that's a counterfactual, the swing factor. So that is and if you used a 5.550, we could have had a whole discussion. What is a good poverty line? Is it too low right now? And if you used at 550, we're talking about 6 million and so on and so forth. So there is a huge issue, and remittances do figure in that. Some countries are hit harder. It's my impression that Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz Republic, the question of value chains and tourism and energy and metals has hit particularly hard. And so the variation across countries is very important. The response in terms of fiscal stimulus in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan do look relatively big, strong, I mean. How are they effective? Are they being used with good governance would obviously be also a question. And drilling down a bit more, you are looking at a shrinking GDP in the first half of 2020 in Kazakhstan. Will it recover in 2021? Maybe we'll come back to that later. And how much? We talked about Kyrgyzstan. Tajikistan, by the World Bank projection, will see a 1.6% growth in 2021. Is that realistic? I put it down here that it may see some growth in the second half of the year. Uzbekistan has some reform agenda that is delivering some benefits, but the rebound in remittances might be related to that as well. So with that as a background in 2021, the honest answer is we don't know. But here is a projection, possibly 3.1% in Central Asia. That seems optimistic, I think. Honestly, I think it seems optimistic because the COVID-19 is now going through new phases, which you all have read about. In this picture, the priorities for 2021 also emerge. I think getting the pandemic under control and improving the health systems and improving education and safety nets will have to be top of the list, at least for the short term. And oftentimes in growth theory, you don't mention them the first. You mention investments as the first, but I reverse that in this pandemic and give the most priority to that, and also building resilience. Now, taking a little bit more of a systematic view, let's go through two or three more structural things. And we touched on this earlier, trade and finance. And the single message here, if you look at, I hope people are able to see the slides clearly. But what emerges is the lack of enough diversification on the second panel. You can see the size of the circles are the size of the economies, but you can see that by and large, the share of exports by the few products is very high. You want it to be low so that it's much more diversified. So there is a distance to go, and this is actually an exciting agenda. Diversification means more inclusion, innovation, bringing more people into the picture and interrelations. And so the first question on trade and finance is actually an exciting agenda. The second one, and these are the SDG goals in different ways, but inclusion and equity relating to that, there must be at least 5 of the 17 SDG goals relating to that. You can see differences across countries when it comes to inclusion and equity. So there is the share in financial terms, internet users, mobile phones, by the various shares of the population. You can see very, very much. And so there is considerable work that we need to do in terms of improving the share or participation of lower income strata in various public services and various aspects of the economy. The Gini coefficient is one that people usually use. In a way, I mean, there are other regions with worse income inequality, you know, that we are all familiar with that. However, when we look at inclusion, it's not just the income, it's not just the money income, monetary income, it's also health, education, quality of education, even how long do you have to wait to get health care if you are in the lower income strata compared to the higher income strata. Are there privileges to the higher income strata that are not available for the lower income strata? If you are thinking about environmental destruction, are the poor particularly hurt? When you combine all of that, this is a gut feeling. My gut feeling is that the income distribution is worse than what the Gini coefficient, which only measures the poverty in terms of monetary income in the region. And I would say it's the same in South Asia, and it's the same in East Asia. The total income inequality seems to be worse than the monetary income inequality. A detail on that, education is one part of that fuller description of inequality. And this picture, there is an interesting report. If you, I've given citations at the bottom, so you are able to download those. It gives you a picture of the number of years of schooling, but adjusted for the quality of education. So we can have a full discussion of that at some point. That in a way, if you expect 14 years of all levels, they come down, well, first of all, because you don't really do 14 years, or they come down further if the quality of some of the years or all of the years is less than 100%. And so you are seeing numbers that vary across the 5 countries, and relative to Europe and Central Asia, the broader region, and definitely relative to Western Europe, Northern Europe, and so on. So this is a priority, how to improve the quality of education. And I say that because we did some regression analysis where we found that competitiveness and income growth are not related to just the access to education, but they are related in a big way to the quality of education, sometimes picked up just by the scores people in different countries have at different levels of education. But the difference is huge. In one study in India, the difference between quality adjusted education on income growth was completely different from simply giving access to education. All right. And then the environment. I think this picture on the right tells it all. I had a sleepless night seeing this picture, the drying up the sea, Aral Sea. But it's just a symptomatic thing about how the world is headed. So you are hearing about and seeing in your own backyard wildfires, flooding in a systematic way that does not exclude anybody. And there is no doubt in the mind of the scientists that this is caused, not associated with, but causal relationship. It passes the test that we also done some research that human-made carbon greenhouse emissions in the air causing greenhouse gases to increase sea level temperatures, increasing the energy levels that drive floods and storms and precipitation, and plus the sheer heat that make the fires work. These will affect Central Asia. It is one of the regions that are most affected by climate change. And so that is a concern. And the big slide or a question on the political economy that I mentioned covers all the previous three being income growth, inclusion of people in the income growth, the environmental protection. All three are underpinned by the quality of governance. Now, there can be debates. We can have lots of discussions. Do straight income, meaning monetary income, is affected by good governance or not? People give examples, particular examples of countries who did not have good governance by the way the specialists would define that, and see very high growth rates. But for every such case, I could give you three cases that go the other way. So we need a systematic, broader analysis. And the evidence is that this is one that not only is an aid, but one that would prevent long-term sustained quality growth if you did not have good governance. It governs everything. So, but worthy of a discussion. And then in particular, I wanted to say that we have lots and lots and lots of examples of bad governance hurting the financial institutions. The 2008 crisis is just one of the big cases in point, and there are several of those that affected the region as well. But I wanted to say that there are some readings, interesting ones, that on education, on health and social protection, these social sectors, there too, good governance is a big contribution to how well those function. And at the end of the day, are there rules of the games? Are there rules of the law? Are there merit-based processes, independent processes? Are there independent evaluations? Do they pay attention to the independent evaluation? It's not enough to have them. Those seem to, at the end of the day, make all the difference to the quality and the sustainability of educational systems, for example. Wish we had more time on that. So doesn't it look like a complex agenda? Yes, it does. Is this a time to talk about it when we are in the middle of a COVID-19? Yeah, I see it's a difficult topic to discuss. But let me just say that there are some conveniences that we have been ignoring. And if we could take them on board, the agenda would seem more doable. In other words, not everybody is going to be working on education. Not everybody is going to be working on financial systems. But if we could connect the people who work on one with the people who work on the other, common meetings, common agenda, common research, working across boundaries, then the complex problems seem a little bit more manageable. So, for instance, I take the case of Kazakhstan. If you have a health project, do the project participants sit with the education team to see how you get multiple effects from the same project by connecting with the project on education, etc., etc. Similarly, environment and infrastructure. Can you imagine having a infrastructure project, forgetting about the environment, and then 5 years later paying 3 times the price of the original because you forgot to sit with the environmental group? Do they get priority? in fact, in the time of climate change. Micro linkages. Yes, I think you may be very familiar with that. The interaction between government, business, and households and civil society. Very, very important. The projects, do they have the participation of the people? Central Asia, a very important and big region, but still in the global sense, needs to connect with the rest of the bigger region of Europe and Central Asia, but also global connectivities. And so connecting the dots from small things like a mission that includes people from other sectors, or a research project that includes people from other sectors, small things to big things like the policymakers really having teams, not sectors, not silos, not separate groups. That is a recipe for short-term gains, probably, but not long-term gains. So I'm suggesting that the agenda is tough, but it is a bit more doable if we had connecting the dots as we go along. So how do we feel about the next decades? Amongst the group that we have today tuning in, how many of us are optimistic? How many of us are pessimistic? I have a feeling that there will be a lot of concerns right now, even if you are optimistic, that they can be addressed. So let me just list 6 here. I had a longer list, but I think these 6 might capture for Central Asia priorities, but then let's come back to that in the discussion. Health investment, this has shown that even regions and countries that think that they are investing a certain share on health, 2.5% is low, can be higher, 5% is very, very good. Similarly on education, but even if you have 3-4% of investments in health, what is the quality? Do people get, what does it mean? Do the poor get access? So that, along with simple things as lifestyle and all the rest, plus preparation of the health systems for pandemics, these would be high on the list, not just because we had COVID-19, but because these are going to happen again. So individuals can lower their own health risk quite a bit and be better prepared. And what this shows incredibly is the role of society and the government on the one side, but also the role of the individual. COVID-19 can be addressed better when the individual takes responsibility as much as the society. So health investment by public, private combined is really the signal for the next decade. Education quality, we spoke about that a little bit, and I mentioned that competitiveness depends on the quality of education, not the quantity alone. Fiscal management, we always emphasize, but debt levels, there are other regions with even higher ones, but that's a particular nature of how the debt is formed, including the reliance on remittances and so on, that fundamentally we need to see an improvement in the productivity of investments. I would not worry as much about a fiscal deficit or a debt if I know that the productivity of what is being spent on is high. A low fiscal deficit with a poor productivity of investment, in my view, personal view, is worse than a high fiscal deficit with a very high productivity of that, because it will bring returns. So it more than will make up. So if you spend a lot on climate, or spend some at least on climate change, and it causes a fiscal deficit, for instance, subsidy for electric cars, I would be completely okay with that if it brings high productivity returns 5 years from now. That's just one example. And then back to diversification. Reliance on commodities alone has never been a basis for sustained growth in any country. So over time, the diversification, and when it comes to oil, I mean, it is fair to discuss even in 5 to 10 years, would we be looking at stranded assets? What happens if you are? What would be the alternatives? And why not clean energy is just as productive and employment creating as fossil fuels as well. So climate resilience, both adaptation, that means This is going to happen, so we need to move to areas and have occupations that are less dangerous. That's adaptation, coping, and mitigation. Those are preventive measures. Reducing the carbon footprint are important. And governance, we talked about a little bit, but the trust between people and the drivers of change would be the critical piece. And so with that, Ricardo, I'm
Yep.
about to close.
Yep.
And closing messages are consistent with where we started, that SDGs give us a very, very good handle. The challenges are multivariate, and crisis makes the challenges tougher, but it is really the best time to take action. And there are some deep areas of action that are relevant for Central Asia. They vary across the 5 countries, but nevertheless, there are some commonalities. And one way to come at these difficult problems would be to connect the dots, work across boundaries, and build trust between drivers of change and the beneficiaries and the society at large. And at the end of the day, COVID-19 is telling us, please build resilience. A high-risk situation without investment in resilience would be tricky. And with that, we should be looking at a tough situation on which we can be a bit more optimistic that solutions over the coming years will help us. Thank you for your interest, and it will be great to hear your questions or comments as we go along. Back to you, Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. It was a very interesting and very comprehensive presentation. I think it's touching upon all the key themes of this conference: environment, education, good governance, and so forth and so on, building resilience. I don't think we could have had a better introduction to what we plan to do over the next couple of days, for which we are very, very grateful to you. And and even Arudin in the opening remarks noted that a crisis is also an opportunity. We need to start making changes to prepare for a different kind of future. Going back to the old normal may not be possible. There are areas in which we need to prioritize, and that's what came out very clearly from what you just said. And I think it was very useful and very interesting what you said about the importance of connecting the dots. But my question to you is, what is the role that the international community and international organization can actually play to help governments around the world actually connecting these dots? Because a key point that you made is that if we had had the Sustainable Development Goals 25 years ago, now we would be much more resilient than we are. But the Sustainable Development Goals were launched and subscribed to in 2015. So unfortunately, that's not the case. So what else the international community could do now to help us connect the dots and make the world more resilient to this kind of crisis?
Should I answer or respond right away?
As you wish. I mean, we're also waiting for other questions. So if you want to answer to me while we're waiting for some other questions, that's fine. Otherwise, we proceed as you see best.
Yeah, let me comment on that, because that's a very fundamental question and a practical one at that. When you think of international organization, I, of course, think about the multilateral and the bilateral financiers, but not only them. There are the international civil society organizations, foundations, and universities, and countries to country. So in this setting, in an interesting way, one area where connecting the dots is most both important but also doable is research. And so I see just too many research projects that are isolated, but there's a lot of references to everybody else. But can't we do them jointly? Or when, say, an international organization like the World Bank does an economic study of Kazakhstan, why can't that study be a Kazakhstan study that is jointly done by the World Bank or Asian Development Bank? And to some extent, I think that's the way it's going. So connecting the dots among people is one thing. and that's probably more doable than many other things. But the financial side, the dollar side, absolutely. I think when you have organizations like World Health Organization on health and so on, um, you know that a pandemic really is regional and global. So there is no way one can solve HIV in the Mekong Delta if you only had a project for Vietnam. It has to be Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Same thing, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. So that kind of a interactive connecting the dots will be furthered by the work by the international organizations like WHO. And a good piece of news in that way is sometimes solutions to, for instance, the climate crisis, much less effective by individual countries. But when the mayors of various cities work together within a country or across, a thousand mayors across various countries, they know what they're talking about better, and they forge relationships. And those are some of the better responses to climate change among the mayors of the different countries. So Central Asian mayors together with Europe and Central Asia and others and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
And finally, of course, in a country, like I said, when we have programs and projects, can we form teams that are a bit more multidisciplinary? Of course, the problem is that when it's multidisciplinary, it takes more time. Once I did a project which involved several, and even to prepare the terms of reference, it took 3 times as long as if I had just done it myself, right? But okay, we learned a lot. At the end of the day, the outcome was more than 3 times better because we
Mhm.
did not miss a huge gap on the environmental side in this case for an infrastructure project, which we would have missed if we didn't take that extra three months trying to do the terms of reference properly. So we have to weigh the benefits and costs. So I thank you for that question. It is not necessarily as intuitive as it is, but when you do put it in a cost benefit framework, the benefits of connecting the dots far outweigh the little bit of a higher cost on preparation that would be longer.
Okay. We have one more question for you. Kwata Akijanov from University of Birmingham is thanking you for the presentation. And he said, you mentioned that Central Asia needs fundamental change, and you put in the center political reforms. Increasing income and wealth inequality are a growing threat for development in Central Asia. Can you please elaborate more on how to change the distributional patterns we are skewed in Kazakhstan and Central Asia? Thank you.
Okay, very good. The colleague from Birmingham, I missed the name, but
His name is Kuat
got it.
Akijanov.
Excellent. Yeah. Hello and greetings. And let me just say that I have worked across Asia, but a little bit more on South and East Asia than Central Asia. But what I was going to say was that this phenomenon seems to be common. Income inequality measured in monetary terms is getting worse, not better. There are some country differences, of course. And why is that of concern? If you look at the world as a whole, almost always the low income and the middle income countries grow faster than the high income countries, right? I mean, I don't know of any period where the OECD countries grow faster than the middle income and low income countries. That's because the gap or the options or the opportunities for the lower groups to grow the production possibilities are much greater because the gaps are bigger and there's more to do. But they can be held back by either bad policy or just negligence. So if we can let the lower incomes participate more in the growth process, the growth rate of Kazakhstan, the growth rate of Kyrgyz Republic, etc., would be higher, not lower. And so it's, first of all, just a pure uh, uh, nationalistic growth criterion that let the growth come more from the low income. Now, this kind of connects with your political reform question. Uh, as it stands, the status quo would suit those who are holding more power than less power, and so they would not give that up. So that's a general picture, probably everywhere. But there are checks and balances in societies that will not, even if that's your instinct, will not let you do that for too long. So political reform that let the checks and balances play out a little bit better. And I'm not a specialist in any of the countries on this particular aspects. Maybe you might comment, or one of you, or Ricardo might comment a bit more. You're a specialist in that. How do you let the political reform unfold? I would say even before the economic reform, but in parallel, so that the economic reform agenda, such as having social safety nets, or more investments in education, or more investment in health that improve the equality a bit better in a good way, meaning that they contribute to growth and it's not just handouts. How will the political reform put a structure where the reformers see it in their interest as much as everybody else's, and the checks and balances would enforce it? So that's a roundabout way of saying that that type of democratization, and I don't mean a Western concept of democracy, but that type of democratization of power would seem to be essential if you want the economic reforms to be meaningful. Otherwise, you can have a lot of things on paper, but they may not really mean much.
Dear Professor Thomas, we have a similar question from Professor Colin Knox from the Graduate School of Public Policy. And he says, you mentioned the pivotal importance of political reforms for delivering sustainable development goals. Isn't this a huge challenge for the regimes of Central Asia? How can the international community nudge governments like Turkmenistan to move in this direction?
Yes. So you can see I'm staying on a bit more of the safe plane on this question, not that because it is one that you yourselves would be more articulate on, but nevertheless, let me start with one of the simpler answers to the question. When you have political reform agenda that's difficult to implement, and since we are on SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, let me stay with that. One of the ways in which the previous Millennium Development Goals helped countries the most, actually they helped them raise money. Those who did well on MDGs did get more financing. So in that sense, they worked. Will SDGs do the same for social and environmental areas is the question. One way was transparency, meaning how are you doing on MDGs then, or SDGs now? Advertise that, list the performance on similar criteria with independent people looking at the data. So no one can say that this is handpicked, but it is an independent assessment, and then publish and publicize those, especially neighbors, say within Central Asia, especially you would look at each other, no question about that. But you would also look at other aspiring nations to which you want to lift the game to. And so in a simple way, not simplistic way, the transparency of data and independence of the assessment, and the data has to be independent also. And here, social data, big data, social media, these are potentially useful. There are also abuses like Facebook and so on. We are facing a lot of problems, but nevertheless, can we have a system on indicators of political reform that can be done on a criteria-based, objective way with independent assessments, which are published and publicized, that policymakers will take note of? And that's just one piece that could spur the political reform need, the political reform even pressure, and the political reform outcome. And we have some examples of where that has worked in public service provision within a country. Very, very dramatic effects of simply saying, here are the laggards and here are the good ones when it comes to public service provision, right? You're aware of that. In Central Asia, you mentioned did you mention Turkmenistan? I think the question would be, can we have experiments that would put to test simple, transparent advertising of who's doing well and who's not doing well? It's not to point fingers, but it is to uplift the cleaner or the more transparent performers in this case, the provision of public services.
Professor Thomas, we have time, I think, for one more question. And the question is the following. Baumol, Lytton, and Schramm in 2007 identified 4 types of capitalism that countries have used to develop their economies: state-driven, oligarchic, big firm, and entrepreneurial. I would like your view on whether the current pandemic will lead low and middle-income countries to refocus their attention on state-driven capitalism, and what the potential benefits and drawbacks of such economic policies may have. The question is from Professor Peter Howie, an economist in GSPP.
Yes. Well, first of all, let me pay tribute to all the 3 questions, including the last one. They are deep, and there is more there than the words thinking and research there. So I do not want to give a flippant answer, but let me point out one thing. When it is state capitalism or much more oligarchic or driven by entrepreneurship, a commonality that would differentiate even within each of them who can be slightly better, because any of them can be better in and of itself, would be the recognition that you're relating it to the pandemic, that the recognition that the pandemic shows that there are these social spillovers which can be easily neglected, and typically more so if you have a heavy hand of government which does not let you see the harm being done in the interest of growth or in the interest of something else on the rest of the society, and it goes unnoticed for too long until it's too late, and then you have to react. So in the economics jargon, it would be the negative externalities that become central to the agenda. So the pandemic has showed that investing in what is society driven as opposed to individual driven, that would have to rise much more. Unfortunately, for the moment, it's not happening at a fast enough pace, and so there's a lot more distance to be gone. The other is, I think, the role of the individual and society. If you thought that this could be the entrepreneurship world, or a it can be the world of free market society. The individual freedom and liberty is paramount. Yes, it has, how it unleashes entrepreneurial spirits, but at the same time, the interplay between the role of the individual, which is huge under a COVID-19 case, and the societal one, the signals given by the President of the United States, for example, on what an individual might or might not in this case of wearing masks do, is a difference between life and death. So, you raised a question on which we should pontificate a lot more, but let me just signal that in a curious way, COVID-19 is connecting to some of the fundamental questions of how society organizes itself.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas, for your presentation and for answering the questions from our participants. And this is probably the end of our session, and I take the opportunity to thank you for joining us and opening our conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.